Hello, Thrive Nation. Well, we're going to sort of break some, conventional understandings about medicine. I've got one of my health heroes. I've read two of his books. I've given it to many, many patients in my other life as a physician, wheat belly and undoctored. He's a real hero. I've just been speaking to him offline, very courageous to speak the truth. He's got a new book, Super Gut, that I've been going through. It is filled with everything need to know about the microbiome, about gut health, about dysbiosis, about SIFO, about SIBO, all these terms we're going to unpack. And I'm very, very grateful for this man because I think he's put something together that is really extensive. Having, talked on the show about the Sonnenbergs and the book Good Gut that I've given to many, many patients as well. I think Super Gut just takes it to another level. I've got my own probiotics here, all the different ranges that I've got next to me that I want to discuss with Dr. Davis because I think he is just now become the expert in this field. And what an incredible person to have on this show. So welcome to the show, Dr. William Davis.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
Brilliant. I want you to give me a summary. There's people that are going to be listening right now. We've got to hook them in, Dr. Davis. So I want you to give me a quick summary of wheat belly and then a quick summary of undoctored. Why people need to listen to this podcast right now about Super Gut.
Okay. So wheat belly came from my experience in trying to stop people from having heart attacks and sudden cardiac death. Well, the primary cause is not cholesterol, by the way. Cholesterol is a franchise built by big pharma for profit. It has little to do with cardiovascular risk. The real root cause is inflammation, insulin resistance, some other things. But from a lipid lipoprotein, cholesterol type measurement that we get by lipoprotein analyses, is an excess of small LDL particles, not LDL cholesterol, that crude indirect measure. Or calculation, actually, not even a measure, but we measure small LDL particles, and small LDL particles are ubiquitous in people who have coronary disease, whether it's a high coronary calcium score, or they had a heart attack, or had 3 stents implanted, or whatever. They almost all have an excess of small LDL particles. When you use a technique called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance of plasma, we get measures like 2,400 nanomoles per liter, particle count per volume. And the science has been clear for over 20 years. The only foods that cause small LDL particles, not fat, not saturated fat, it's grains and sugars. So I took grains and sugars out of people's diets, and lo and behold, small LDL drops to 0 or something close to that. It's eradicated with that maneuver in diet. So I did that, and people would come back and say, "You didn't tell me I would lose 73 pounds. You didn't tell me that my type 2 diabetes would be so much better. I'd have to stop my insulin, my metformin, and my Byetta injections. You didn't tell me my rheumatoid arthritis would go into remission." And so this crude experience meant to address coronary disease via small LDL particles turned into this explosion in discovery. And then I asked why. Why the heck would removing the food that all government agencies, all health agencies, American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, all agree you must make the centerpiece of your diet? Why would doing the opposite yield extraordinary and shocking effects? And that would lead to the whole wheat belly experience. But as powerful as that experience was, it didn't take everybody 100% back to health. So somebody would say, yeah, I lost 73 pounds, but I have 40 more to go. That's how bad it is in the US. People are so obese that that's how much weight they have to lose. Well, they're stuck. Or my hemoglobin A1C, of course, that long-term measure of blood sugar, dropped from a horrendous 12.9% to 5.7%, which is dramatically better, lengthening their lives and reducing potential for things like kidney failure, but not perfect. And they say, how do I get down to 5.0? So I looked for answers elsewhere. And even though the basic wheat belly program did include high potency multi-species probiotics, fermented foods, and prebiotic fiber, it was clear that there was more here that we had to do. And that's what led to the whole Super Gut experience.
Brilliant. And Dr. Davis is a cardiologist for many, many years. I think you've sold over 4 million books. We're going to put links to the 2 websites that I've had look at, Dr. Davis Infinity Health, and I think Undoctored website. But we'll put those links in the show notes. But just give us a quick wrap, because Undoctored was also opened my eyes in terms of hospital stakeholders, what their motives are, what is happening in the US in terms of ensuring that these companies or big corporations and big pharma succeed as a business.
I think it is worst in the US, where the profiteering motive in healthcare is unrestrained. And of course, now we have direct-to-consumer drug advertising only here in New Zealand. And, if you watch TV here, it's shocking. Every third commercial is for a drug. And these are not drugs that are generic. These are drugs that cost $4,000, $10,000 a month.
Sure.
Typically biological agents, because that's where all the money is, and that's what they're doing. And so unfortunately, the money is ruling the message. And so people like you and me are actually no longer even welcome on TV or major print media. And so getting this word out has been so critical for me, because it's not coming through the media, and it's not coming through, you had to essentially give up medical practice to speak the truth. And I have also, because I know if I try to deliver these kinds of messages in practice, it's very difficult. Insurers say, "What are you doing? Oh, you're only supposed to do heart catheterization, stress testing, and ask people about their cholesterol. All this other business, we don't cover that stuff." So it's very difficult to deliver the truth in the modern world. But the thing that I get concerned about is the decimation we've introduced into the human microbiome due to all the things we're exposed to. So, most of us in the US by age 40 have taken 30 courses of prescription antibiotics.
Sure.
According to the CDC, for every 1,000 Americans, 800 prescriptions for antibiotics are written every year. That's just antibiotics. That's not even factoring in the herbicide, pesticide residues that occur in food, water, and air, the glyphosate that is, if we measured all of us in the US, our hair, skin, urine, blood, and looked for glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, we'd find it. We're all exposed to glyphosate. Glyphosate's an herbicide, of course, but it's also an antibiotic. But it's an antibiotic of the worst kind, because it kills off healthy bacteria like lactobacillus species, and is ineffective against pathogenic species like E. coli and Klebsiella. So it essentially selects for unhealthy microbes in the human body. And then there's all the other things, food additives like emulsifying agents, synthetic sweeteners like aspartame, other drugs. It's becoming clearer and clearer that if it's a prescription drug, it probably screws up your microbiome. I think the list of drugs that disrupt the microbiome is probably far greater than the list of drugs that don't disrupt the microbiome. So we've all screwed up our microbiomes. But one of the consequences is an outright loss of numerous species. Pardon me. There have been studies done of the indigenous populations. Pardon me. Sorry. There have been studies done of the indigenous populations on this planet, a few remaining groups, like the Malawi in Eastern Africa, the Maasai, the Hadza, the Matsas in Peru, the Yanomami in Brazil, the Maori in New Zealand, some of the isolated tribes in New Guinea. And when they've had full detailed microbiome analyses, they have microbes that we don't have, and they have far greater numbers. Well, so the question I asked is, what happens if we restore some of those microbes?
If we look at what the microbiome is, let's sort of unpack exactly that is, because people might not understand what the microbiome is. And then obviously all these changes with our microbiome, because of all those factors you've just mentioned, and causes a lot of problems, but dysbiosis being one of them. So let's take people on a journey of saying, okay, this is your microbiome, dysbiosis, SIBO, or SIFO, or a combination of all three.
So one of the first things I did was look for the species that we've lost. If we did go to New Guinea and looked at the so-called shotgun sequencing of the microbes in their gut, They all have, for instance, a species called Lactobacillus reuteri, which is my favorite microbe in the world.
Yeah.
Reuteri is Reuteri, named after the German microbiologist, Dr. Gerhard Reuter, who discovered it in breast milk in humans in 1962. And back then, in the 60s, he could find Reuteri in just about everybody. It was everywhere. Today, almost nobody has it. Less than about 5%, 4% of humans retain this microbe, even though in that New Guinea study, 100% of them had Reuteri. So we've lost it over the last 50, 60 years or so because Reuteri specifically is very sensitive to common antibiotics like ampicillin. So if you took ampicillin for a urinary tract infection, for instance, you've likely lost Reuteri. Well, I love this microbe because when we restore it, and we restore it in very high numbers, so we do it as a yogurt. It doesn't have to be yogurt, just one very easy to ferment kind of food, not store-bought yogurt. That's something entirely different. I regret calling it yogurt. It's not yogurt, but it looks like yogurt, tastes like yogurt, but it's not yogurt. But we make this thing with Reuteri. We get upwards of several 100 billion counts of microbes per half cup serving. You eat it with blueberries and chia seeds or something like that. And it boosts oxytocin, the release of oxytocin from the hypothalamus. And people say things like, I like my family better. I like my coworkers better. They're less irritating to me. I understand other people's point of view better. The ladies go nuts because one of the effects of oxytocin is it causes an explosion in dermal collagen. So they start to lose their skin wrinkles within a few weeks. There's also a restoration of age-related muscle loss. You regain muscle and strength. There's preservation of bone density. In one study, there was 50% less bone loss compared to ladies on a placebo. There is a wonderful sleep effect. I'm a chronic insomniac. I've always struggled to sleep, having to take all kinds of things just to get a few hours of sleep, watching TV at 3 o'clock in the morning, all that stuff. I now sleep 9 hours straight through, vivid dreams. Those of us who use actigraphic devices like an iPhone, Apple Watch, or a Fitbit, or an Oura Ring, all record 20-25% increase in REM duration, which of course is the restorative phase of sleep that helps you maintain good mental health. There's suppression of appetite. Food still tastes great, of course, but you are in absolute control over impulse and temptation. And there's an increase in libido and the erotic content of dreams, much like you had when you were a teenager in your 20s.
I know you've got a story about that yourself, about a dream, but we won't go into that. I've heard that on a podcast.
I'm impressed to know that.
Let's talk. So dysbiosis is a change in the gut flora or deficiencies in certain bacteria that you need. How would you define, dysbiosis? And obviously the two types of Reuteri that are very important that you speak about. Maybe you can unpack that.
So as you know, there's really no happy definition of dysbiosis. We know we are dysbiotic. We know that modern people have mucked up, lost species, allowed unhealthy species to proliferate, but it's not quite clear what is eubiosis. That is, what is a healthy, happy collection of microbes? Should you and I mimic the microbiome composition of the Yanomami or the Hadza? Nobody knows, because those populations, that their microbiome to some degree is an adaptation to their unique lifestyle and environment. So maybe we don't have to do that. So it's not quite clear how far back we have to go in retracing our steps before. It's probable that we should go back maybe a century, when, for instance, stool pH was much more acidic, was 10-fold more acidic than it is today. And the less acidic poop of today likely reflects the lack of healthy acidic metabolites that come from the microbiome. But it's a work in progress. Nobody knows. But it is clear. So the things I mentioned about Reuteri, that's one microbe. That's just one microbe. So imagine we find another 7 or 10 or 20 microbes to replace. And that's what we're doing, by the way. We're replacing these microbes that one by one seem to yield spectacular effects. The other issue you raise is, well, if you lose healthy microbes, what arises in their place. And that's where we have the issues of SIBO, SIFO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, where unhealthy microbes, given the loss of these gatekeeper healthy microbes, have proliferated and then ascended. And, you know, I thought this was an unusual issue until a few years ago. I thought, oh, SIBO, no, that's unusual. It's rare. But something happened, and that is this thing came out. The AIR device. Yeah. AIRE from Dublin, Ireland, a PhD engineer who invented it for his wife, girlfriend then, now his wife, because she had irritable bowel syndrome and had a difficult time navigating a low FODMAPs diet. He saw how awful it was when she got something with FODMAPs, that is fibers and sugars, and she'd have bloating and diarrhea and emotional effects. Well, he invented this to reflect hydrogen gas in the breath when she got exposed. Well, I got my hands on it a couple of years ago. I called him up. I said, Angus, you understand what you have done? He says, no. I said, this is not just a device for IBS and FODMAPs. This is a device to map out where microbes are in your GI tract and to understand better all these terrible food intolerances. You know, in the US, I don't know if it's quite as bad in South Africa, but here people will say, I can't eat this list of 48 foods. I can only eat fish and green leafy vegetables. That's all I can eat. If I eat anything else, like an orange or an apple or some legumes, I'm going to have diarrhea, panic attacks, bloating, joint pain, skin rashes. And so they say, so they think it's a problem with the food. It's not a problem with the food. There's nothing wrong with the food. It's you. It's the microbiome that has allowed these apparent food intolerances. Well, now we have a device. What shocked me, so I have thousands of people now testing, and I have no relationship with the company. It's a cool device. You know, so you having practiced medicine, you remember how bad diabetes was before finger stick glucoses? You know, we had urine dipsticks. Yeah. So we had type 1 diabetics having amputations, kidney failure, and blindness in their 20s. Well, it's still a bad disease, but it's much better because we have finger stick glucose, now continuous glucose monitors. This is the same thing for intestinal health. It is a game changer for intestinal health. But what surprised me when thousands of people started testing themselves was it was the rare person who tested negative. Now, we might challenge the validity of the test and say maybe the test is BS. But I can tell you what's happened is people have identified microbes living in the upper GI tract, SIBO, taken some steps to eradicate or push back those microbes. And then not only do they normalize their H2 levels, it's a 0 to 10 scale with each point representing 5 parts per million for those of your listeners who are familiar with conventional H2 testing. So if they start with a 10, it goes down to a 1.3 or something like that, and their rheumatoid arthritis is now gone completely, or they finally break a weight loss plateau, or they can now eat beans without discomfort. So a lot of the phenomena associated presumptively with SIBO. So I believe it's not, the test is valid. It's not a perfect test, but it's the best we have. And it's a major development in understanding and managing intestinal disease.
Brilliant. Now, I checked on Amazon, you know, I find out about this device. I mean, obviously gastroenterologists have this device, but it's very expensive, you know, for people to go. I'm just thinking from in my other life as a physician, if we can order this from Amazon, it's the Model 1 or the Generation 1 you've got is available. But if you try and get the Generation 2, it's not available for South Africa. And when you go to the website in, I can't remember the name now, I'm just trying to think of it as I'm going because I was there.
Food Marble?
Food Marble, they don't deliver to South Africa. So now, is it worth people that are listening to get Generation 1, the one that you held up there, those on YouTube, Dr. Davis held up the AIR Generation 1, or should they try and get Generation 2?
You know, the first generation, that's what I have. I haven't even got mine second generation yet. It only came out literally 2 weeks ago. I talked to Angus Short, the engineer who invented it, just on the day of release 2 weeks ago. So the first device measures hydrogen gas. Hydrogen producing microbes in SIBO is the dominant gas. So if you get this, you do identify most of the varieties of SIBO. The new device measures methane, which is an issue mostly if you have constipation, because the methane producing microbes slow intestinal action, intestinal peristalsis. And so if people who struggle with constipation should probably wait to get the second generation device. Now I don't want to fail to mention that you don't need to buy a device in order to succeed. Sometimes what I call the telltale signs of SIBO, SIFO, et cetera, are so overwhelming and powerful and persuasive that you don't need it. It is nice to have something to track. One of the problems we have is recurrences, of course, when you do these things. Let's say your initial symptoms are gas, bloating, diarrhea, and joint pain. You get rid of it, you feel better. Oh, yeah, everything's better. 6 months later, you have a panic attack. Is that SIBO or not? Because the recurrence of SIBO can be dominated by a new collection of species, and so have different symptoms. So it is nice to have to check, and you can share this with your family and other people you're intimate with, not your neighbors and coworkers, like you wouldn't share your toothbrush.
Yeah. Oh, so you can't actually just have it at my practice, and then let a patient come in who's struggling and get a reading. So there's obviously some collection of bacteria in there, or do you have to get a device per patient or client, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's more, it would be like using a toothbrush. You wouldn't have a community toothbrush in your office. So now, maybe if a mom wants to share it with her child or her partner, that's okay, right? Because we all share microbes and other things.
Okay.
But as a cost-saving maneuver. But people don't need to buy this thing. There are signs, for instance, that are so consistently associated with SIBO in particular, bacterial overgrowth in particular. For instance, if you have some conditions that are virtually synonymous with SIBO, fibromyalgia is at the top of the list, restless leg syndrome, very close to 100% of people with those conditions have SIBO. People who have inflammatory bowel diseases or irritable bowel syndrome, very high likelihood of SIBO. People with autoimmune and neurodegenerative disorders, people with fatty liver, the great majority have SIBO, and numerous other conditions. And so, or if you have residual problems, I see this in my program. Somebody says, you know what, my triglycerides drop from 380 milligrams per deciliter down to 125, which is great, but it's not perfect. Perfect is 60 milligrams per deciliter or less. Why is it stuck? Well, that's a really good sign that you have SIBO. This didn't make sense until Dr. Patrice Kenny in Belgium in 2007 finally validated what many of us suspected for many years, and that is that the microbes of dysbiosis and SIBO, there's trillions of these creatures, and they live and die in the space of hours and days. They don't live decades. And so rapid turnover, and when they die, some of their breakdown products enter the bloodstream. That, of course, is called endotoxemia. But it now tells you and me how microbes in the GI tract can be experienced as depression or Lou Gehrig's disease or Alzheimer's dementia in the brain, or as psoriasis and rosacea in the skin, or as the joint and muscle pain of fibromyalgia. In other words, virtually all modern common chronic diseases that afflict modern humans need to be re-examined, redefined in light of this finding of endotoxemia from bowel microbes.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about treatment, rifaximin, and you got 2 herbal products that you speak about in the book. How people give them a bit of a process on. I know it's in the book, and I'm going to stock the book. I'm going to give it to patients. I mean, this book is just a watershed book. I can't say enough from someone like yourself as a cardiologist. I think this is going to leave an incredible legacy. Just like I said to Dr. Perlmutter about his drop acid in terms of uric acid, it's going to leave a legacy. And I can only sort of just say thank you in the most incredible way to you, you courageous health heroes. But tell us the process of treating SIBO.
Well, thank you for that. So there's several choices. One bad choice is just say, this is too complicated, I'm not going to be bothered, because that has real health implications over the long run. Unaddressed SIBO leads to accelerated aging, metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel diseases, neurodegenerative disorders. In other words, burying your head in the sand is very unwise. And by the way, doctors like you are in the minority. This science is so new. You and I have to just know that most of our colleagues are about 20 years behind in the science. And so I have colleagues say to me, there's no such thing as SIBO, despite the thousands of
Wow.
research studies validating these
Wow.
ideas. But choices. One would be, as you point out, the conventional antibiotic rifaximin or Xifaxan, which is about 40 to 60% effective. The problem with that, of course, you go to a John Q gastroenterologist, he hands you a prescription, if he even knows what SIBO is, but gives you no idea how you got it, how to increase the efficacy from the 40 to 60%, how to prevent recurrences. They're just not that helpful. There are some herbal antibiotics, which I was very skeptical about, until a Hopkins study, retrospective, compared two herbal antibiotic regimens, the candibactin and the FC-cityl dysbiocide regimen, to rifaximin, and they proved superior, a little more efficacious, and actually were successful in Xifaxan failures. But lately, I've been trying, and this is very preliminary. If you and I take a conventional probiotic for SIBO, will it get rid of the SIBO? No. You might have a modest reduction in bloating and diarrhea, but the SIBO is still there. You still have microbes living in the upper GI tract in large numbers. So I asked a couple of different questions. I asked, well, what if we chose microbes that colonize the upper GI tract? And what if we chose microbes that produce bacteriocins? These are natural antibiotics that microbes produce, typically effective against the species of SIBO, the proteobacteria. So I chose three. I chose a strain of Lactobacillus gasseri, the BNR17 strain. I chose the two strains of Reuteri, the 17938 and the 6475 strains, in the gastrus product. And lastly, the Gneden strain of Bacillus coagulans. I know this is a lot, but the GBI 36086 strain. It's a hassle, a little bit of a hassle, but you get those three strains. It's gotten a little easier, by the way. The gasseri we had to get from South Korea, from the company who commercialized it, but now it's been picked up by some retailers. When you order from manufacturers, they say things, oh, we're happy to sell it to you 150,000 bottles at a time.
Wow.
So, or something like that. So it takes a lot of money to get started, but some of the retailers have done that. Now we can get these things a little more readily, at least in the US. I think it's still kind of a hassle in Australia and South Africa, but it's getting easier. But we get those three microbes, we co-ferment them together as yogurt. Now we ferment for an extended period, so we get lots and lots of doublings, 12 doublings or more. By our flow cytometry studies, we get something like 250, 260 billion counts per half cup serving, and we eat a half cup. And so far, of about 30 people who've done this, 90% have normalized hydrogen gas
Wow.
on the air device. Now, that's informal. We'll probably do a formal trial down the road. We have several trials lined up. It's one of the later trials we'll perform. And it won't be as yogurt, of course, it'll be as a probiotic, because yogurt's kind of tough to do in a clinical trial.
Yeah.
And prove once and for all this is possible. But right now, it's so benign. It's a little hassle, getting a little bit of expense, getting those three groups of microbes, and then you make a yogurt. But I think we have stumbled on a way to use a yogurt to get rid of SIBO. Now, I don't know if this applies to methanogenic overgrowth, probably does not apply to fungal overgrowth. So it applies mostly to the H2 producing form of SIBO, the most common form.
So do you think you would take this candibactin, ARBR, and the FC-cityl dysbiosis and do that first, and then you would then use the Reuteri's and the rest of them to try and sort of repopulate and ensure that you don't get callback? Or would you just go straight and find out that the study that you're going to do is going to be using these type of bacteria to help?
If the potential treatment was really hazardous, if I said you need a frontal lobotomy to get rid of your SIBO, you better be damn certain you have SIBO, right?
Yeah.
But if we're talking about a few dollars in making yogurt, it's so benign that I think it'd be reasonable to try that first.
Okay.
By the way, you do still experience die-off with this practice. I think the pivotal ingredient is the Gasseri. This strain of Gasseri produces up to 7 bacteriocins. It's a bacteriocin powerhouse. Even the Rhodori produces up to 4 bacteriocins. So we're really aiming kind of machine gun at all the species of SIBO. Now, but it is preliminary. But it's so benign and so accessible that I think I'm telling people now, try it first.
Okay, before trying out a month. Okay, and before trying out the herbal or the rifaximin in that case. Okay, good.
I didn't say that a year ago. A year ago, I was saying exactly what you're asking. That is, let's start with Candibactin or the FC side. Let's start there and keep the SIBO yogurt in reserve. But it's been so uniformly effective. I think it's more effective than the antibiotics.
So I'm going to have to find Gasseri and find the 2 strains of Rhodori and then coagulans. Is that what you said as well?
Yeah, so we get the Lactobacillus gasseri BNR 17. Remember Joe Mercola?
Yeah.
He has the deep pockets. He made the minimum order, as he sells it as something called BioThin. Now here's a little secret. So we're getting the Lactobacillus rhodori from BioGaia, the Swedish company that sells it as Gastrus in very low counts for babies. Now, we have to be aware of strain effects. So to illustrate, you and I have E. coli in our guts, your listeners have E. coli, but if you ate lettuce contaminated by cow manure with E. coli, you can die of that E. coli. Same species, different strain. So strain does matter. But in the case of rhodori, I have 8 strains of rhodori in my refrigerator, and I've made yogurt with all of them. And this is just anecdote now. I have over-the-top effects from rhodori, including very deep sleep. And I know when I don't get that effect because I'm awake all hours of the night.
Wow.
I've had this effect from all 8 strains. In fact, I think I have at least 1, maybe 2 strains that are more effective. Now, that's my personal anecdotal experience. We have a small mouse trial lined up where we're going to take 5 strains and compare them. Baseline oxytocin, 4-week oxytocin, and see if one strain is better. We'll compare. I think it's going to turn out that we don't need to get those gastro strains, that we can get other strains. So just bear that in mind. The only strain I would ask your listeners to not use is the 30242 strain. That's the strain that comes from UAS in the US, which is a big manufacturer, an hour from my house. And that's commercially sold. So it's 30242. Don't use that one. There's nothing wrong with it, except it has no bacteriocin. So for this specific application, we're trying to eradicate microbes, don't use that strain. Wow. But the other strains, the numerous other strains of rhodori probably are effective for this. And then the last strain came from a company called Ganeden, but it's called and I'm sorry about these strain designations, they're not my fault. It's the GBI 30 6086 strain, which is sold in the US as a commercial probiotic and is actually available in most big stores. Okay. You can get that. That's pretty readily available. But you co-ferment them, extended fermentation, right? So if you take them as capsules, the numbers are too small to really have a big. We want a big effect, right? We don't want a grain of sand on a beach. We want big dump trucks of sand to have an effect. And so that's why we ferment for extended period. It doesn't have to be dairy. It could be other things too. Yeah. Dairy just happens to be very forgiving. And we ferment for 36 hours to get these big wallops of bacterial numbers. And that's what seems to be the secret here.
Maybe take us through the process, because I know you've got some type of device or yogurt maker, and then it's a certain temperature for certain strains or certain bacteria. Is it important? And do you actually just you buy the bacteria, then you put it in this yogurt maker and you put it at a certain temperature? What is your base? I mean, obviously your base is very important from a yogurt perspective. It's got to be, when I ferment kefir, which I want to talk about, it's got to be raw milk and then the kefir grains, and got to watch it. How do you actually ferment these all together, and possibly the bacteria compete against each other or not, or they just double, or how does it actually work?
So microbes, just like other creatures, they existed, polar bears like a different temperature than, say, some tropical creature. So that just like other creatures, microbes likewise. So if you want to grow microbes and you want to get real serious about this, so in the Super Gut book, I give you all these recipes. If you want to make let's say lactobacillus gasseri, not just for SIBO, but maybe you want to reduce arthritis pain. That's what it's effective for that. If you want to shrink your waist, ferment this one. If you want smoother skin, ferment the reuteri. If you want to recover more quickly from heavy exercise, ferment the Bacillus coagulans. And they all ferment at different temperatures. Many ferment at around human body temperature, about 37 degrees Celsius, but some of them are exceptional. So for instance, if you want to make Bacillus coagulans yogurt, which is a delicious yogurt, by the way, because you want to reduce arthritis pain and you want to include it as part of your SIBO, it likes 115 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about what, about 42, I think, Celsius, something like that. Well, so it really helps to have a device, a yogurt maker, a sous vide device, an instant pot, or some means of varying your temperature and timing. Now, if you don't want to go through that hassle, if you just get a device that keeps things around human body temperature, that'll also do. Unfortunately, a lot of yogurt makers that have preset temperatures, factory preset, are typically set to 108 to 114 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's about what, 40, something like that. Well, reuteri dies at that temperature. So if you have a device where you don't know what the temperature is, put a thermometer in, let it run for an hour or so and see what the temperature is. So there's no, people don't have to memorize all these temperatures. It's all listed in the Super Gut book.
Yeah.
For this, ferment at this temperature, for this amount of time. Now, as you point out, microbes don't have sexual reproduction. There's no male, female microbes. There's no mommy, daddy microbes. They just double. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4. Well, reuteri doubles every 3 hours at 37 degrees Celsius. And so, if you and I were yogurt manufacturers, a manufacturing company has to speed up production for profit. So they ferment for 4 hours. So you can imagine if you made reuteri yogurt and you kept it in your vat for 4 hours, you ain't got nothing. There's nothing in there. So we add gellan gum, xanthan gum, guar gum, carrageenan to thicken it up because it's not fermented. There's nothing in there. So we're going to let it double 12 times. It's kind of like the old kids riddle. Which would you rather have? $1 million or a penny that doubles every day for 30 days? And kids always say, I'll take the $1 million.
Yeah.
Not recognizing that the penny becomes over $5.5 million at day 30. But if you look at the curve of money growth, the increase doesn't really occur till about day 27 and 28. So you got to be patient. Likewise with microbes. If a microbe doubles every 3 hours, you don't see really big numbers till about hour 33. So if you're fermenting 4 hours in a factory or 12 hours in your kitchen, like many home yogurt makers do, you really don't have much to speak of in numbers. So we're going to ferment for 36 hours. And by the way, when we did our flow cytometry studies, if you go longer, 48 hours, you tend to get no further increase and maybe even a decrease in numbers, probably because you're getting too much competition for sugars and other resources. So 36 hours seems to be the magic number, give or take. It doesn't have to be 36 hours on the dot. It could be 38 hours, something like that. But 36 hours is the period of time that for reuteri allows 12 doublings. Now, that's not true for all microbes. So one of my other favorite microbes is Lactobacillus brevis, which is a microbe often found in fermented foods like kimchi and fermented sauerkraut and some fermented meats. It has spectacular effects, reduction in inflammation, in blood pressure, blood sugar, all kinds of metabolic benefits, protection from colon cancer. I like it because it also produces something called phenylethylamine, which is a nootropic. It makes us a little smarter, a little more clever, a little more creative, a little better memory for about 6 hours, and then you revert back. And it's also a mood elevator. So it's not a big effect; it's a modest effect. I experienced it. I had to write a piece on skin health, and that's not my area, as you know. I'm 25 years practicing cardiology. I don't regard myself as an expert in skin health, but I had to write a piece on skin. And I thought, oh man, this can take me a long time. It's hard to think about. I have to refer to all the studies, make sure I get it right. I thought it was going to take me 8, 9, 10 hours to write. I sat down, 8 o'clock in the evening, glass of wine, whipped it out in 45 minutes.
Wow.
That's
And
how
for
you
those
gauge.
that are listening, Dr. Davis had chronic insomnia. He now sleeps 9 hours. You got to look on YouTube when we upload this because his skin is incredible. So obviously all these strains, it's very complicated. I really suggest you get the book because it's, you got to get the right bacteria. You got to get the right strain. I think this is important. You got to leave it for 36 hours. So there's some fundamentals here to get the benefit that Dr. Davis is talking about. Isn't that right?
Yeah, what really excites me, I call this the world of microbiceuticals. Because think of what we're talking. We're talking about smoother skin, reduction in joint pain, eradication of depression. That's a big one, by the way. SIBO and endotoxemia are clearly a major underlying cause for depression, especially depression that does not respond to antidepressants, autoimmune diseases. I think what we're doing is creating a world parallel to pharmaceuticals, but without all the hassles, problems, side effects, and ridiculous costs. I think we're getting to a point where you and I can say things like, if you've got condition X, get these 5 microbes.
Wow.
And you will likely experience dramatic improvements. And it may cost you a few dollars. It's not going to be $90,000 like pharmaceuticals now cost. So I'm very excited for the future, provided you and I are allowed to say these things in the future.
Yeah, well, that's why we've got the book. So I think we've covered SIBO, and I think that's important. And obviously, if you've got any dysbiosis or gut issues or IBS or IBD, I really recommend that you get the detail. But I do want to talk about the person who wants to prevent disease and prevent sickness or prevent all these conditions, what they should be taking. I've got an array of probiotics. I've done my organic acid tests, and I've got a very good microbial diversity. And I think that's important. So I'm going to just read out and it's not about the name. I'm not throwing stones at any sort of company or any corporation, but the one, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, just at least 5 different probiotics that I try and use. And maybe I can get your perspective. So this one has got Bifidobacteria brevi, Infantis longum, Lactobacillus acidophilus, Delbrueckii, and then Lactobacillus paracasei, and then Plantarum. So I don't know what you think of the first one. Is that someone should take? Maybe I should run through all of them. The second one's got Lactobacillus acidophilus, getting that wrong. Bifidobacterium lactis is the second one. The next one has got a proprietary blend of Bacillus indicus, Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus coagulans, Bacillus licheniformis, Bacillus clausii. That's that one. And then the last one here that I've got is Bifidobacterium lactis and Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Saccharomyces boulardii. Those are the 5 that I've got there. I don't know what you think in terms of alternating, or someone who's really healthy out there wants to prevent disease.
Nobody has the perfect formula for a probiotic, and the current crop are kind of unsatisfactory. They have a lot of problems. It's getting better. So one thing I want to see probiotic manufacturers do is always specify strain. So if you don't know the strain, you have no idea if it does anything for you. So to illustrate, for instance, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG strain is the strain that's been shown over and over to abbreviate a post-antibiotic diarrhea. Other strains don't do that. So if you have Lactobacillus rhamnosus, no strain specified, you don't know what the effect is. So the failure to specify strain is one issue. Another issue is failure to include what are called keystone species. These are species that are very important for other species, like plankton in the ocean. If you don't have plankton, you don't have whales and jellyfish. So it's a keystone species. So failure to include keystone species. Another thing they failed to do is to factor in, now in their defense, this is so new that they haven't had a chance yet, but they failed to factor in what are called guild or consortium effects. That is, microbes are just like humans. We don't all live in isolation. We have families and partners and communities. Bacteria do also. The only product I'm aware of that incorporates that is my friend, Dr. Raul Cano, a microbiologist in San Diego with 40-year academic career. he and Martha Carlin formed a company called BiotiQuest, and they have a product called Sugar Shift. Despite the name, it is a consortium, and I have no relationship with that company. They're just my friends. Martha's in Colorado. Raul developed this consortium of microbes that when you put them together, they have much bigger combined effects.
Okay.
And one of the effects is it reduces blood sugar by about 10 milligrams per deciliter. That's why they call it Sugar Shift. But it's a consortium of microbes. So there's a bunch of things not yet factored into modern probiotics. There's also my friends, Brendan Stan Watson, who founded Renew Life, which was the largest probiotic company in the US until they sold it a few years ago. They have data to show that the more species you have, the greater the diversity you generate. So they compared in a dog model 10 species versus 60 species, and the 60 species had so much more of an effect on the microbiome. So those are kind of basics of probiotic composition that I don't know of a perfect probiotic yet. I think the Sugar Shift is a great start. There's a product called in the US Symbiotic 365 that has incorporated some of these ideas. And there's some mistakes being made. Unfortunately, there's a very well-funded company in the US, I won't say its name, that uses double encapsulation because they fell into the mistaken notion that a probiotic must survive stomach acid and bile to get to the colon. Well, what about the hundreds of millions of people with bacteria in the upper GI? You want release in the upper GI tract. So double encapsulation, I think, is a miscalculation. I think another mistake being made is this notion that spore-based microbes are the only kind that work, because one of the products you have is a spore-based product, and that's not true. You don't have to have spore-forming microbes to survive stomach acid and bile. And in fact, I'm seeing problems with some of the spore-based products, inflammation, some other problems. There are clearly good spore-based microbes, like our friend Bacillus coagulans and Bacillus subtilis. Those are two good ones, but there are some that are just not tested sufficiently in humans.
Okay, so what does a person do out there, Dr. Davis? I mean, that was a really, very good summary of what's happening out there. I mean, the person's thinking, I'm busy, I'm hectic, life's just got, so much on my plate. I want to take a good, probiotic or a spore biotic. And, I got 23 years of empirical evidence. People have improved with these. They've come back and they've told me. So there is science and research, and I think that's important, but there's empirical evidence. And as you know, is sometimes the most important is, does the patient improve and not? So what is the listener out there? I mean, this is a fundamental question. What do they do with probiotics? Yes, we want them to make the yogurt and get the strains. We're going to have to find a distribution channel with that, make it very easy for people. Otherwise, they're going to just come to a functional medicine doc, like me, and get a probiotic. What do they do?
Well, I would emphasize that the most important probiotic comes from fermented foods. So not just the yogurts, but kefirs, kombucha, veggies you ferment on your kitchen counter. On my kitchen counter, I have about 5 different jars filled with vegetables, and they've been there for weeks, some of them months, and they're delicious and they're filled with microbes. So that should take priority. It seems foreign to modern people, even though our great grandmothers would slap us because we're not eating fermented foods all the time. They did all the time. And, this is much more of a thing in Europe, of course, and in Asia. In the US, hardly anybody eats fermented foods. The invention of refrigeration that became affordable in 1927 in the US because of the invention of Freon as a refrigerant, everybody forgot that fermented foods were extremely powerful. So that's the most important. And some of the microbes that come from fermented foods, like Leuconostoc mesenteroides and Pediococcus pentasaceus, are extremely powerful. But then if you turn to a probiotic, given the inadequacies of current products, look for the ones that have the greatest numbers of species. If you know what the strains you're looking for, see if they contain the strains you're interested in for the effect you want. Make sure it has at least some of the keystone species. Now, this gets a little complicated, but Lactobacillus reuteri is a keystone species. Lactobacillus gasseri is a keystone species. I like to include a fungus, Saccharomyces boulardii, but that, we all here, my following, we make sparkling cider or juices with the Saccharomyces boulardii. You can buy it as a probiotic. In the US, it's called Florastor. It's called something different in South Africa. I can't remember what it's called, but it's widely available for a few dollars. Take a capsule, empty it into apple cider or other juice. Just make sure there's no preservatives like potassium sorbate in it, and cap it lightly, because it's going to produce so much carbon dioxide that if you cap it tightly, it'll explode. So cap it loosely, and within 24 hours, keep it on your counter, room temperature. You're going to start seeing it bubble. It's a vigorous fermentation, and then refrigerate it at about 48 to 72 hours to stop fermentation. And you're going to have sparkling, effervescent cider or juice filled with high counts of Saccharomyces boulardii. It's delicious. You can even make a martini out of it because it's tolerant to alcohol. But it's a really easy way. I'm all about saving people money. So you can buy a probiotic, you can ferment it as yogurt or other food, and you don't have to buy it again. You can use your fermented food as the source for all those microbes. Now, as you point out, if you're fermenting, let's say 20 species, your 10th batch in, because you make subsequent batches from a little bit of the prior batch. You don't have to keep on re-inoculating. But about the 10th batch or so, you're having different, some microbes are better at fermentation than others. You're going to have a change in composition. So at the 10th batch or so, you want to re-inoculate or start from scratch, but you're cutting your costs because these darn probiotics are expensive. So you can ferment foods with your probiotic or with microbes like Saccharomyces boulardii, and you can save a lot of money that way and get much greater bacterial numbers out of it.
Brilliant. Quickly, just about SIBO, do you use the Saccharomyces boulardii? How do you treat the SIBO? What would be your sort of strategy?
I think the boulardii is a choice. The downside of it, it's a fungus, so it competes with other fungi like Candida albicans, Candida glabrata, et cetera. So you can use it. The downside is it's really slow to work, taking probably a minimum of 2 months, but it's just juice. It's just sparkling juice. We drink like a quarter cup 2 or 3 times a day to limit carbs. The process of fermentation cuts carb content by about 50% when you use a hydrometer to measure it. So that's one choice, just kind of long and slow. One of the things that I've been doing is starting out with some of the herbal preparations. We have pretty good evidence that berberine or curcumin, because of extremely poor absorption. I'm always amazed that the curcumin industry, they'll say, if you take 100 milligrams of curcumin, you poop out over 99 milligrams. So we're going to try to force absorption. Well, no, the evidence is pretty clear. Curcumin works via the microbiome and the intestinal barrier. It fortifies the intestinal barrier. So we want non-absorbed. We don't want the piperine, bioperine, nanoparticle emulsions. We want just plain old curcumin. And it has antifungal effects as well as some modest antibacterial effects, as does berberine. We've been using some food-sourced essential oils, very dilute, extremely caustic. They burn if you take them directly, but we dilute them like a couple of drops in a tablespoon of some oil like extra virgin olive oil. Do that 2 or 3 times per day. And that also seems to be generating some very good effects. People have eczema, for instance, which is largely a fungal condition, and they see their eczema recede typically within days of starting some of these essential oils. These are food sourced like clove, cinnamon, and oregano. But you want, ideally, there's somebody like you supervising them, because it can be dangerous if you don't do it exactly right. But that's been very effective for us. The downside of fungal overgrowth is there's no counterpart like the air device for you to monitor it. So you have to go by whether some phenomenon that makes you suspicious for fungal overgrowth, like eczema or sugar cravings or wild mood swings. You want to see if that's receding as your index. You could do serial stool specimen analyses also.
Great. And just last thing, let's talk about oxidative stress. Is there a lot of research on, developing a robust, diverse microbiome in terms of oxidative stress, like HSCRP, looking at things like oxidized LDL, maybe your liver enzymes, GGT, maybe looking at T3 to reverse T3 ratio, a lot of these signs and symptoms of inflammation, which is a driver of disease. You've spoken about sugar control, which I think is crucially important, in HbA1c, but what about the inflammatory markers? Is there a lot of research and science on that?
I wouldn't say a lot. There's some, but there is, and anecdotally, I can tell you that we do see drops in C-reactive protein, IL-1 beta, IL-6, rises in the anti-inflammatory IL-10, TNF alpha. It's actually quite dramatic. Now, I should qualify that by saying this is not just about the microbiome. So people who do my programs also do wheat and grain elimination, limit net carb exposure, and supplement with nutrients that are largely lacking in modern life, not the diet, but modern life, like magnesium. By necessity, we all drink filtered water because water's tainted now with sewage and other things. So we drink filtered water, but water filtration removes all magnesium. So we supplement magnesium. Vitamin D, even in a sunny country like South Africa, most people are still deficient because we wear clothes and we work indoors, et cetera. So we replace a handful of nutrients before we get to the microbiome. So, but just those basic efforts, diet coupled with restoration of a handful of nutrients, that alone reduces C-reactive protein, IL-1 beta, TNF alpha. So, but then we throw on top of it, addressing the microbiome. The biggest effects are clearly in people who have SIBO. So, of course, SIBO, 30 feet of microbes, which, by the way, as you recall, the drainage of the GI tract is not into the systemic circulation, it's into the portal circulation. And so your poor liver takes a beating when you've got SIBO and all these microbial breakdown products hammering your poor liver. And so GGT is an indirect marker of SIBO, as is fatty liver, by the way. So one of the drivers of fatty liver is portal circulation endotoxemia. Not something easy to measure, of course, because you can't really get portal vein blood readily. But that is becoming clear that SIBO is a big part of the reason why a lot of these inflammatory markers are high. We need better science. We certainly need a lot more science exploring this endotoxemia. But I think it's going to change almost everything we say about disease. So one of the best examples to illustrate is depression. So as you recall, this question has been asked. There are a lot of people who don't respond to the SSRIs, to antidepressant medication. So the question was asked a number of years back, what makes those people different? Well, one of the distinguishing features of people who don't respond to antidepressants is they have higher inflammation markers, C-reactive protein, et cetera. So remarkably, this was done in 2 studies in Germany. And I'm shocked this was done. I don't know how they got it through the review board, but they took normal, non-depressed people and injected bacterial endotoxin, lipopolysaccharide, which, if there's a slight miscalculation in dose, you can kill somebody. It's very dangerous. So they injected endotoxin into these normal volunteers, and within 3 hours, they suffered profound depression.
Sure.
And on MRIs, they had all the hallmarks of depression. So they did this twice, suggesting, put it all together, suggesting that depression, at least in an important subset, is due to endotoxemia. So the solution is not to get involved in serotonin uptake or blockade. It's to address the SIBO and endotoxemia that's driving the process. And by the way, anecdotally, those of us who've done this do see dramatic changes in mood, relief from panic attacks, anxiety, and it changes, this is tough to quantify, but it changes the internal dialogue we have with ourselves. You got to wonder if a lot of the anger and hate we have, there's always been anger and hate among humans. Humans are violent creatures, right? But you got to wonder if a lot of the violence and hate and ill feeling that people have now is driven by the microbiome, and can we change it? Just reuteri, good old reuteri that boosts oxytocin. But even further, what if we could get people to, address their SIBO and endotoxemia? Could we start seeing a reduction in depression, in suicide? In the US, even pre-pandemic, there's been a 35% increase in suicide since 2005. Huge increase in suicide.
Sure.
And I think we could argue, has yet to be proven, we could argue that at least part of that is due to disruption of the microbiome.
Sure. Well, I'm definitely going to be looking at getting my yogurt maker, getting these strains going, and spending some serious resource and time, doing this, because I think it's fundamental. I mean, even the link between that and the vagus nerve, it would seem that we've done a lot of episodes on the vagus nerve and cervicovagopathy and what happens with stress and heart rate variability. There would be a good way to treat the vagus nerve by making sure that the microbiome is diverse and robust. And obviously the other way around, if the vagus nerve is healthy and we're doing a lot of things that are helping reduce stress, the microbiome improves. What is your view on stress in the microbiome?
Huge effect. That's how I got a few years back, SIBO, SIFO, that taught me firsthand how to manage these kinds of things, because I went through extremely personal stress, divorce. That was very difficult for me emotionally and financially. But I see this over and over and over. The people who have to take care of a parent who's got cognitive impairment, which is a 24-hour day job. It's very difficult. Or a child, say, with autistic spectrum disorder, or financial ruin. All the things we're exposed to, a bad marriage. So the world is filled with stress. And one of the things that falls apart with stress via a not entirely certain mechanism, but probably by way of cortisol and norepinephrine, epinephrine effects on the microbiome. There's some evidence, for instance, that the stress hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, cultivate the proteobacteria, the stool microbes of SIBO.
Sure.
So, so I think that as time goes on, this idea that stress has a major influence on microbiome composition and location is becoming much more of a potent argument.
Great. We're coming to the end of the show. I've only got a couple of questions. I could carry on. I've got so many more, but maybe we can do round two. If you had to look at a biohack, infrared sauna, ozone therapy, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, cold thermogenesis, or cryotherapy, what would you choose from a hormetic stress point of view? Possibly exercise as a hormetic stress. What would be your go-to to say to someone, hang on, go and do cold plunges or cold showers, or go and get some ozone or hyperbaric or infrared sauna? What do you think is going to be valuable for the microbiome?
I don't know. My experience with those things is extremely limited. I had a daughter who's a pro tennis player, and she had a concussion. And so she did try the hyperbaric chamber. I think it worked. And my friend David Perlmutter suggested doing that because he's had a lot of good experiences with that. But I'm sorry, I just don't have much experience with those kinds of things. I will say that in my experience, the biggest power comes from, so I try to tell my followers, get away from the idea of treating disease and get towards the idea that we're going to address the factors that have been messed up by modern life. And more often than not, disease goes away, regardless of the label, whether it's labeled rheumatoid arthritis or migraine headaches or psoriasis or depression. More often than not, it goes away. So let's, and what we're doing in effect is mimicking the adaptations, the life that humans are adapted to, that we see still live by the Yanomami or the Hadza or the Maasai. They live outdoors and kill things with the spear, club, or axe. They dig in the dirt for roots and tubers. They gather berries. And so if we revert back to that, of course, we're not going to run the loincloth and kill a wild hog, but we can kind of do that by not eating grains, which is a modern adaptation. Primitive people do not eat grains. We do not restrict fat. We live outdoors or get vitamin D, at least by some means. We can't drink river water, so we get magnesium, but we're mimicking the behaviors as best we can in a modern setting. And likewise, the microbiome. The real path to the microbiome is to not be exposed to antibiotics, herbicides, pesticides, and probably kill something, eat its stomach and intestinal tract raw. Well, your listeners don't want to do that. So we've got to make do with such things as fermented foods and yogurts and probiotics. And so I restrict myself most to trying to recreate a primitive setting in a modern life. And so I've not really indulged in those kinds of, so my apologies.
No, let's talk about quickly. I've got one more question. I've got so many, but ancestral living, like giving, even biblical writings about greeting one another with a kiss or holding pets, hugging trees, obviously all these bacteria. Tell us about something, obviously, intimacy between a husband and wife. There must be a large change in the skin microbiome. That's important, or hugging others. Obviously the pandemic, not touching one another, has probably caused all this, all this stuff that they're sanitizing has killed a lot of good microbiome. So what do you think about those ancestral practices?
I think there's great value in them, but in a world where we have lots and lots of humans and we transmit more than healthy microbes, we also transmit viruses and bacteriophages and Staphylococcus aureus, methicillin resistant. So it's, I don't have a full answer for you, except that I think it is important. I agree with you that having pets can be helpful. Being outdoors, touching the soil, whether it's with your feet or hands as you garden. Being close to other people, not being fearful of their microbes, but it is a little bit hazardous in a world filled with billions of creatures, where we share all viruses, bacteria.
Okay, 80% of South Africans over the age of 50 have hypertension, Dr. Davis. In 8 years' time, 50% of the US population will be obese, according to Perlmutter and many other stats. Give us a message of hope to the people that are listening out there, what they need to do other than get Supergut, which I think is their number one book that they need to get now, because I think it is a science and an area that they really need to grow in. I need to grow in this. I mean, just looking at strains and looking at what I'm giving, yes, I've had some success, but I think it's just in its infancy at this stage. But give us your message of hope to South Africans and Africans and those, and actually 40% of my listeners are in America, but give us the message of hope.
Sadly, I'm always shocked when in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the people who draft the U.S. dietary guidelines for Americans, American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, all these agencies, government and otherwise, all say it's your fault. You're fat and diabetic because you're a glutton, because you're lazy, because you're stupid. I don't think that's true. I think the guidelines are flat wrong. They got it completely wrong. The problem is they're never going to admit it because there's liability, especially in the US where people sue each other. And so they'll never say, hey, all that stuff we told you about cutting fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and calories, we were wrong. And in fact, our advice contributed to the worldwide epidemic of obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. We'll never hear that. But what I think it means, sadly, is that we ignore dietary guidelines because they're wrong. They were largely crafted by commercial interests. And so we have to listen to podcasts. And of course, we can't even listen to TV anymore because that is also controlled by commercial interests. So it's people, I hope, like you and me who are free to talk. And so don't listen to national guidelines. Don't listen. If the American Heart Association and assorted agencies said, we are just about education, we don't take commercial money, we're only about educating physicians and the public, that would be great. But that's not what they do. They take money from Coca-Cola, from Pfizer, from Merck, from Medtronic. And so that's their constituency. It's not the public. So they say things friendly to commercial interests. So I don't think you and I and your listeners can fix that by tomorrow. So what it means in practicality is do this to convert to official guidelines.
Well, I declare favor and blessing over you, Dr. Davis. I thank you. If there's any way we can support your calling and your courage, and I think there's many, many more books you're going to write. You're sleeping well, your brain's going to function well, your microbiome's incredible. So I'm looking forward to many books, and hopefully one day when I come to America, my mentor's in Fort Myers, Florida for the last 12 years. Hopefully we can see you. And there's a lot of people like Frank Schellenberger, who's been on my podcast, Thomas Levy, the cardiologist, has been on my podcast, David Perlmutter, Terry Walls now. So it's just, we're getting there. There's an incredible array of people, and South African doctors as well. But it just seems that there's a huge, there's a lot of people gathering like yourself. They're saying no more. We are going to do this together. And there's enough finance for a lot of the biohackers and those in natural health to actually get by. So that's encouraging. So thank you so much.
I love that, Steve. That's such a great idea.
Yeah,
I would support it. If you lead the charge, I'm right behind you.
Well, with your books and your mind and your communities, I think we can do this together. And I've always said community, the multiple communities around us are crucially important for health and wellness. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Continue doing what you're doing because it is so important.